Sally Omnibus. So something I've noticed about a lot of self-identified liberals online is a sort of 90s nostalgia. Understandable, as many of them grew up at the time, but it's not just for the music or the games, but the 90s optimism zeitgeist, that the political and social stability that defined the decade, as well as the West, specifically the United States' dominance, had really demonstrated to the world that the model of social liberalism, mixed capitalism, and political democracy were the best way of organizing society, and that they were really the only things needed to make a functioning and prosperous nation, and that as time went on, the world would begin adopting this model, and that the major problems, be it poverty or war, would be eventually phased out. And I think a lot of classical liberals still today feel this way. Of course, how wrong we all were. So I think I can provide an outside perspective on this whole 90s nostalgia thing. You see, I'm on the younger end of the millennial generation, and while I was born in the mid-90s, I don't really remember anything from it. The first memories I have of the world outside my own life would have been events like 9/11 and the Iraq War. So instead of growing up with Will Smith and Bill Clinton, I got to grow up with 9/11, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the constant threat of terrorism, Hurricane Katrina, the massively unpopular Bush administration, the culture war between the religious right and the secular left, the recession, the highly polarized Obama administration, the Tea Party, and Occupy Wall Street. And by the time I reached college in the early 2010s, I could tell that there was something severely wrong with our society, economy, and government. The reason I'm laying all this out is that I grew up in a world that was, and still is, marked by crisis after crisis, year after year, social polarization and mounting instability, with economic uncertainty and inequality, and by now, with people growing numb to weekly terrorist attacks, it's safe to say that in the 21st century, chaos has become the order of the day. This is in stark contrast to the 90s, which, while it certainly had its crises, was a far more stable time than now, and I think that while a lot of people realize this and recognize that there are fundamental structural failings in the West right now, they don't seem to realize that the whole sort of model of society that we thought was sustainable and beneficial in the 90s just isn't applicable to the modern age. So let's work back a little bit and lay out broadly how I think the 90s consensus came about, and before I do that, I'll briefly define it as I think the 90s consensus is the belief that the best way to organize society, developed in the 90s, was on the model of nations in Western Europe and the United States. That is, with a high degree of political, social, and economic freedom within a secular framework. And that these were really the only things necessary to build a functioning and prosperous society. And that the events of the previous decades understandably give a lot of credence to this idea, if nothing else, than by process of elimination. Old world traditional autocracy had died in the First World War, fascism had died in the Second, and the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And so liberalism was not only seen as the only ideology left standing in the West and around the world that was dominant, but it had really prevailed and conquered in the major conflicts of the 20th century, and it's only natural that it was seen now as the best ideology. I think that the decade of the 90s only helped to reinforce this. With the fall of the Soviet Union, there was no more ideological challenge to liberalism in the form of a concrete political entity. Economically, it was very clear that the Western model of organizing the economy through a mixed capitalist system had resulted in both the most innovative economies and highest standard of living in the world, and that with America left as the sole military, economic, and cultural superpower, Western dominance was seen as assured. The 90s also saw, for the first time in decades, at least in the United States, a downward trend in violent crime. And of course, the 90s also experienced the full onset of the digital revolution when the internet, CDs, and cell phones, and the personal computer began to see widespread use and utility. So, with sustained economic growth, rising standards of living, declining crime, and rapid technological change that was making life ever more productive and convenient, and with a high degree of social and political stability, you can't really blame people for arriving at the conclusion that the economic and political structures built in the 90s or in place in the West at the time were built to last and were going to lead to an unprecedented level of prosperity in the future, and that the Western model could be applied to any culture, and that really any major problems could be solved by minor adjustments in the economy or government. And of course, it was believed that this was expanding well outside the West, and that both the developing world and the former Soviet bloc were going to gradually adopt the Western model, and a prosperous, peaceful future and liberal democratic one seemed a very real possibility. If the structures were so sound and society was doing so well, why did it all fall apart in the past 17 years? I mean, economic and technological growth have been consistent, and yet not only are liberal values not being implemented around the world, but their hold in the West itself is shrinking. Western influence is not only not expanding, but it's contracting. And Western dominance is not just being challenged from without by forces like a re-emergent Russia and groups like ISIS, but it's being questioned and challenged from within by the far right and the far left. And why is it then that, despite all the predictions and optimism, it seems every single facet that defined 90s society has completely collapsed, and we're now in a period of unprecedented instability and uncertainty, and that this is despite continued technological progress and economic growth? And I think this is my primary concern with a lot of liberals online, who seem to think that the major problems we face right now, be it the far left or Islam or the alt-right, are just sort of quirks in the system, and that society is still at its heart secular and liberal, and that once the SJWs and the Islamists are discredited, then society will just sort of return to normal, return to the way it was in the 90s. And they often use comparisons to the religious right with the far left or Islam, that these are sort of just interchangeable forces that are challenges to liberalism, that they can really just be debunked in a few videos or debates and everything will go back to normal, that people sort of naturally realize that liberalism and secularism are really the best way of living. And I think this kind of thinking is what's ultimately going to kill liberalism. What they don't seem to understand is that the forces that are opposing liberalism right now, like the progressives and like Islam and the alt-right, they're not doing it because they just decided to come out of thin air one day and challenge a system that was perfectly fine. People realize that liberalism is failing right now, that it's not able to answer the questions of the day, and that alternatives are sprouting to offer answers. The reason why the SJWs are openly protesting free speech right now is because liberalism and liberal dominance over society is the weakest it's ever been, and the progressives know this. So where does this leave us then? Well, I think the obvious is that we need to fundamentally reevaluate how society operates, because if the past 17 years have taught us anything, it's that the liberal and secular model that defined the 90s just isn't capable of producing a stable and even sustainable society, that things like culture and religion are not going away, and that they're not secondary to economics and politics, and that human societies are far more complicated than things that we can just sort of adjust and all the problems will go away. The 90s may have been a great time, but it's never coming back. Diabana.
To push into mighty nations, but who's crazy enough